Bom dia, eu sou Pedro Marim, editor de opinião de Opera Mundi, editor-chefe da revista Ópera, e está começando mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos. Guerra na Ucrânia, genocídio em Gaza, tensões entre China e Estados Unidos, golpes bem-sucedidos no Sahel e tentativas de golpe em países como Brasil, Bolívia e Venezuela. A prosperidade geral prometida pelo neoliberalismo nunca chegou. O bem-estar social sonhado pelos europeus esfacelou-se junto à União Soviética. Os avanços tecnológicos cada vez mais assustam a humanidade ao invés de iluminá-la, e pode-se proclamar, finalmente, que o fim da história chegou ao fim. Mas, afinal, o que explica o fato de vivermos tempos em que a guerra volta ao horizonte, se é que ela já saiu dele? Que forças estariam por trás das tensões no mundo e das incertezas cotidianas que nós vivemos? Para discutir esses temas, o Opera Mundi recebe hoje o historiador e jornalista indiano Vijay Prashad, diretor executivo do Instituto Tricontinental, editor da Leftward Books e correspondente-chefe do Globetrotter. Nós falaremos com ele já, logo após a vinheta. Antes da primeira pergunta, eu queria convidar você que assiste a esse programa gravado a se inscrever em nosso canal e, se possível, tornar-se membro pagante. Good morning, Vijay. Welcome to 20 Minutos. It's an honor to have you with us.
It's great to be with you, one of the great programs in Brazil. So it's my honor, my pleasure.
Vijay, I'd like to start with a more general topic. If the genocide doesn't stop in Gaza soon, we will complete a year of total Israeli war against the Palestinians in just over a month. We are already in the second year of the war in Ukraine. Why is the promise of a relatively peaceful world after the fall of the USSR not coming true? What forces are driving these wars?
Well, for that, we need to go back actually to the last days of the USSR. If you may remember that around the time when the USSR went into a crisis, the United States government began a series of conflicts against countries that, in a sense, were being disobedient to the emerging New World Order. In 1989, the United States went in without any warning, without any United Nations resolution, attacked Panama, attacked the presidential palace, sent special forces onto the ground, grabbed the president, Manuel Noriega, and took him to the United States, and now he's sitting in a prison in Florida. That was the first. Look, Manuel Noriega wasn't a saint. In fact, he worked for the US Central Intelligence Agency. He was part of the kind of duplicity regarding the drug war and so on. But still, having been the president of Panama, this kind of violation of sovereignty was extraordinary. And it was the opening, because after Panama in 1989, we had an attack on Iraq in 1991. This, of course, leads us to Yugoslavia in 1999, where a country was destroyed, when in fact the possibility of ceasefire occurred, and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, uninterested, went and bombed Yugoslavia, and by the word of many experts, increased the number of casualties. From there, we go to the war in Afghanistan, started 2001, Iraq, the illegal war, 2003, the hybrid war against Iran starts in 2005, the sanctions against Venezuela, 2006, and then they keep deepening. The blockade on Cuba, of course, continues. I mean, we can go around the world and see conflicts and conflictual patterns increase everywhere. So there was really no peace moment after the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States felt that it was now in charge. You know, the old Latin phrase, primus inter pares, first among equals, that it was in charge and it was going to impose its vision of globalization on the world. Now, there were some countries that resisted, North Korea, Syria, Libya, Cuba, Venezuela, and so on. United States called these countries rogue states. What makes them rogue? What makes them rogue is that they were not willing to submit themselves to the idea of primus inter pares, the United States being first among equals. And those countries began to be sanctioned and punished and so on for being disobedient. The word disobedient occurring many times in US government reports. It's like a naughty child had to be punished and so on. This continued, right till, let's say, the global financial crisis that opens up the third Great Depression after 2007. From 2007 onwards, United States sees its role in the world beginning to diminish. Other countries appear, India, China, Brazil, and so on, begin to take great strides on the world. During Lula's first administration, for instance, he became a statesman of the world. He was, in a sense, taking up room that the United States had said it's only ours. US Secretary of State, US Department of Defense Secretary, they are the ones that should walk into a meeting and say, I'll broker a deal. But Lula was there in the middle of the negotiations between the Europeans and the Iranians, for instance, almost secured a complete deal. This period after 2007, particularly, when these countries begin to assert themselves, this period is when the United States starts to much more aggressively use its military and its economic force to constrain countries. Now, something like 70% of the developing countries are under US sanctions. It's mind-blowing. The Washington Post has done a long story on US sanctions. I mean, it's reached that stage that one of the main papers in the US is worried about sanctions. Marco Rubio, US Senator from Florida, so worried about the impact of sanctions. In other words, he was saying that sanctions are producing de-dollarization, and de-dollarization means the United States cannot control countries. He said that openly. It's not a coded message. You don't need WikiLeaks to leak things. They are saying these things now. And so in this period, we are considering this an era of hyper-imperialism, because in this period, the Western leadership and their bourgeoisie has become incredibly decadent. In what sense decay? They don't have any new ideas. They don't know how to develop the world. They can't put together enough resources to build bridges anywhere. And because they've become decadent, narrow, and so on, they produce such pathetic characters to run their countries. Olaf Scholz, Keir Starmer, Kamala Harris. I mean, these are shadows of people that have imagination. They're phantom leaders, not real leaders. And as a consequence of this, these countries are even more dangerous. If you don't have an authentic project for development in the world, you'll use the hammer to try to control countries. So in my opinion and the opinion of our institute, the war in Ukraine, which the US just will not allow it to end, the war in Gaza, the US just won't allow it to end, have sold Israel over $1 billion of weapons extra since the war began in October. The pressure campaign on China, the potential invasion of Venezuela, all of this stuff is a sign of a decadent Western leadership which has a dangerous capacity to do harm in the world. So that's how I would understand, Pedro, the increase in hostilities in our period. And it's true. It looks like there are many more wars going on. I think that is actually a fact of our time.
Yeah, you spoke of this decadent imperialist power, and there's a debate in the left about how to interpret such conflictive word. Fundamentally, there are two visions. One, according to which the fundamental element is the U.S., meaning it dominates the imperialist chain, and another one, according to which there's an inter-imperialist dispute, meaning Russia and especially China would have aspirations to take the place of the United States and rebuild the imperialist chain around itself. What's your view on this debate? You talked about hyper-imperialism. I'm assuming you are leaning more to the first option.
Well, the thing is, it's not me leaning anywhere. It's the facts. And I think that's important. Look, I understand the literature on imperialism going back 100 years. 100 years ago, it's true that there was inter-capitalist rivalry, let's say between Germany and Britain. And that inter-capitalist rivalry between British firms and German firms brought in their governments. And inter-capitalist rivalries became inter-imperialist conflicts leading to war. I understand that. I'm not naive about the theory. That's true. That's exactly what happened empirically. Vladimir Lenin, who wrote one of the canonical texts on this, imperialism, wasn't writing a general theory of imperialism which would be transhistorical, which would apply for every moment. Lenin was writing a conjunctural text about the moment of the First World War, the Great War. Lenin was asking the question, why is this war happening? That was the question. And the way Lenin argued it was a deep analysis of intercapitalist crises through monopolies in different countries, leading to an inter-imperialist war. Today, we don't really have intercapitalist conflicts at this scale. Now, why don't we have that? Firstly, most capitalist firms are highly integrated across national borders. It's very hard to talk about Apple, for instance, as a US company. It is a US company, but Apple produces its products mostly in China. So is Apple a US company or a Chinese company? This was not happening 100 years ago. You know, Nike makes no shoes. Nike is a brand. It has patented its brand. Nike shoes are made in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and so on. Capitalist structures, unless they are small capitals, small manufacturing, and so on, the big monopoly-esque manufacturing firms are highly integrated across borders. So inter-capitalist conflicts don't necessarily lead to inter-imperialist conflicts because it's much too complicated than it was 100 years ago. That's the first point. Secondly, if you look at military spending, the United States, its NATO allies, plus the couple of NATO partners, South Korea, Japan, and so on, they account for 75% of world military spending. 75%, okay? Put that to one side. The Chinese account for about 10% of world military spending. And this third statistic your audience may be surprised by. Russia accounts for 4% of world military spending. Let's add up Russia and China just for the hell of it. Although Russia and China do not have a military alliance. They do not have a military alliance. It's very important to state that. They have a strategic alliance, not a military alliance. That means if one is attacked, the other does not come to its aid. The NATO countries are a military alliance. So one military alliance accounts for 75% of world military spending. has 900 some bases around the world, can destroy countries in an afternoon, know how to blow up bridges, don't know how to build them. The Chinese are a defensive country. They have built a defensive military. They are defending themselves against what they see as great threats. Russia is a defensive country. It is defending itself. Okay, Russia invaded Ukraine. I understand that. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine was about defending Russia's sovereignty. Putin kept asking the West for security guarantees. He wasn't asking for Ukraine. He just said, I want you to guarantee the security that you won't put short-range nuclear missiles in Ukraine, in the Donbass region, and so on. So for those who say, well, what's the state of the earth? I would say, let's look at the facts. Let's have a fact-based analysis. It's not an opinion. The facts lead you directly to the conclusion that there is one imperialist power in the earth. There are lots of defensive powers that exist that are able to defend their borders. Russia is able to defend its borders with nuclear weapons. China is able to defend its borders with nuclear weapons. There are lots of countries that cannot defend their borders. Libya could not defend its borders, right? So these are defensive powers, not offensive powers. You cannot label a war between an imperialist offensive power and a defensive power an inter-imperialist conflict. That is just people who have stopped after reading Lenin. They misunderstand the nature of the text and they are nostalgic about their theory. They have taken their theory from 100 years ago and are applying it today. My friends, I'm a Marxist. I build my theory from the facts. I don't build my theory from what I've read. I don't go to Marx to get quotations like a devout Christian would go to the Bible. I take Marx and I tear the book apart to understand what he's saying about today, not about what he said then and how it should apply to today. This is a wrong attitude. So those who say there's an inter-imperialist conflict, I would say, what are the facts to demonstrate that?
Yeah. As I said in the introduction, we are approaching the first year of the continuous genocide against the Palestinian people since October 8, 2023. I mean, before there was genocide still, but 1 year since then. In your view, you already talked about how the U.S. is helping Israel right now. Why hasn't the genocide stopped yet? And most importantly, is there a way to stop it other than by military means?
Look, I don't know. If I knew the answer, if you knew the answer, we would do something about it. Yesterday, the Palestinian ambassador to the United Nations said something very moving. He said, for God's sake, we have to do something beyond condemnation. Condemnation is not having any impact on Israel. I think he's quite correct. What else can you do? The most important thing is an arms embargo on Israel. The other day, on the 10th of August, the Israelis dropped a 250-pound GBU-30 bomb on a school and a mosque, killed 100 people, one massacre. Al-Tabain school bombed. One bomb, not one bomb, a number of bombs, but on one building, 100 people massacred. That bomb is made in the United States, sent to Israel by the United States, and most likely loaded onto an Israeli plane by a US technician, most likely. I don't know for sure, but in many of these cases where the US sells this kind of ammunition, they have people who load it themselves. So my thing is, let's seriously think about an arms embargo because Israel cannot produce the weapons for this damage. And here, it's 90% of the weapons come from two countries, okay? 76% comes from the United States, 76%. Roughly 20% comes from Germany. And Germany and the United States have been the most vigorous defenders of Israel for this war. Two countries. If two countries can face an embargo of sending weapons to Israel, Israel would just not have the weapons to continue this murder. They just wouldn't. But the people of United States and Germany must be held accountable for the fact that they have not been able to constrain their government. This is a question for those two countries. What can you do in Brazil? It's not like the government of Mr. Lula is arming the Israelis or giving them diplomatic cover. What can I do in Chile? It's not like Gabriel Boric's government is arming the Israelis or giving them diplomatic cover. As 500,000 Palestinians live down the road from me, they are simply not going to permit it. This is down to the United States and Germany, two countries in the West. This comes back to the question of hyper-imperialism. Who are these countries? What gives them the right, the three of them, Israel, United States, and Germany, to conduct a simultaneous genocide against the Palestinian people? My opinion, that's the only thing, is an arms embargo. Everything short of that is what the Palestinian ambassador said. Now, of course, it's possible for the Egyptian army and the Jordanian army and the Syrian army and the Lebanese army, including Hezbollah, to try to enforce a no-fly zone. Why don't Egyptian planes fly over Gaza and prevent the Israelis from continuing the bombardment? That's a question for Egypt, for Jordan, for Syria as well, and for Lebanon. Why not? Why haven't they done that? The only military force in the region that has been trying to confront the Israelis and stop the genocide is the Ansar Allah government of Yemen. That's the only military force. Of course, Hezbollah has been contesting Israel on the northern border, but that contest of Israel may not be sufficient. And by the way, Hezbollah has paid the price for that. One of their generals killed and so on, and many people killed on the border. So it's not like they're just sitting there doing nothing. At least Hezbollah and Ansar Allah doing something. But where is Egypt? Egypt was the crown of the Arab world, sitting on their hands doing nothing. I would say, Pedro, the Egyptian people, the German people, the population of the United States is complicit in the genocide of the Palestinians because they can actually do something. People in Japan, what can they do? They said, we are holding Hiroshima Day. And then the question was raised, we can't have the Israeli ambassador come. I mean, that's all they can do, symbolic things. But people of the United States, Germany, Egypt, maybe Jordan can do something tangible. They need to act. You and I can't solve this problem.
Yeah. Vijay, you're always traveling, globetrotting, writing articles about the places you are and you have been. And I suppose that in many places there's behavior similar to something we see in Brazil, which is people looking at the American elections as if they are determinant of their future and cheering for one or another candidate as if they could vote for them. Is there any significant difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, specifically for the people in the third world? Should we be cheering for one or another?
Yesterday I was in the Cordillera up in above Santiago in a forest, and the forest ranger who was walking with us said something interesting. He said, if you ask a child in Santiago, what are the animals that live in the forest? The child will say lion, tiger, elephant, and so on. The child is not going to say puma, condor, Zorro, the fox, and so on. It's very interesting how we detach ourselves from our place and put ourselves somewhere else. The expectation that when it's Christmas, there should be snow outside. Most places that celebrate Christmas, including Bethlehem, okay? There's never been snow in Bethlehem. So the idea of being detached, a kind of colonial notion of our history is very much there. So of course we are all invested in what happens in the US, partly because it would matter if there was a good candidate. And this good candidate said, we're going to pull up all 900 military bases. We're going to stop spending so much. It would really matter to us who won. In this case, because you framed the question like this about does it matter to Brazilians or Chileans or Indians or Zambians or whatever, I think it matters zero, frankly. It matters zero. Because there's a kind of permanent imperialist habit and apparatus in the US government. It's a permanent structure. It doesn't matter who comes. People used to say Obama is going to be better than Bush. Come on, he started doing illegal drone strikes to kill people, including killing US citizens in Yemen. Anwar al-Awlaki was a US citizen. He was murdered by Mr. Obama, who sat in his office and signed a note saying, assassinate the following 20 people this week. Every Thursday, he would look at the kill list and sign off on it, say with actual names of people that he would say should be assassinated. No judicial review, no international law, nothing. This was Obama, who was supposed to be this great liberal. No, people would be naive if they believed that the person who enters the White House, particularly these characters who are the main favored candidates, they cannot change the balance of forces. Then they will not, because they are not committed to it. Now, if it was another situation, if there was a serious socialist challenge to this, then I would say, well, we should be all paying very serious attention. Of course, we will continue to pay attention. That's because we are colonized subjects. We think there are elephants in every forest. That's a different matter, Pedro. But does it make a difference who wins for your life? I don't think so. Maybe some marginal difference. It's true. If you're running a, say, clinic for reproductive health of women, if Trump comes in, the international funding will die immediately. Of course, it makes a difference, not trivial. But by and large, they're both going to bomb you. I mean, one of them may fund your reproductive health clinic, but both of them will bomb that clinic.
Yeah. Before we proceed, I will take just 1 minute for advertising. Bom, antes de continuarmos, eu queria pedir a contribuição financeira de vocês para a Opera Mundi. Além de fazer uma assinatura solidária em nosso site, operamundi.com.br/apoio, você também pode contribuir conosco se tornando membro pagante do nosso canal no YouTube, como eu disse na introdução, fazendo uma contribuição pela ferramenta Valeu Demais quando assistirem aos nossos programas gravados, como a esse programa, ou ainda fazendo uma contribuição por meio do Pix. A nossa chave é apoie@operamundi.com.br e nossa razão social é Última Instância Editorial Ltda. A mais eficaz de todas as armas contra as fake news é o jornalismo de qualidade. Apenas o jornalismo de qualidade coloca a verdade acima de tudo. E esse jornalismo que a Opera Mundi busca oferecer todos os dias depende da sua contribuição. Vijay, recently we had elections in Venezuela. The country's electoral body, the CNE, proclaimed Maduro the winner, but the opposition has contested the results with the support of some Western governments, especially the US government, and Blinken saying they don't recognize Maduro and taking some steps back a day after that, whatever. What is at stake in Venezuela right now, and how do you assess the positions of countries like Chile, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico?
Well, first, let's just stay with Venezuela before we come to the rest. I mean, it's a country that has had sanctions on it since 2014 in an intensified way. There were sanctions before then. The country relied for 95% plus, more than 95% of its revenues, particularly dollar revenues, came from oil exports. The middle of 2013-14, oil prices fell. Mr. Chavez, who was the leader of the Bolivarian process, dies in 2013. For the last decade, the country has been under attack. Nicolas Maduro, who took over from Hugo Chavez, had a very difficult job. Firstly, he had to take over from this incredibly charismatic man. Secondly, oil revenues disappeared. Thirdly, sanctions increased, including attacks on him personally. Fourth, Mr. Maduro had to improvise to make sure that people weren't dying, in enormous numbers. So they had to open up sectors of the private business, because if the state is under sanction, you've got to have goods and commodities come in. They had to start privatizing, not by choice, but by necessity. And then 6 million Venezuelans left the country. They are sanctions refugees. They left the country also as part of a kind of exercise of power by the right wing in the region. Sebastian Piñera of Chile said, please come to Chile. Almost 500,000 Venezuelans came just to Chile. A very large number of out-migration from the country. 6 million is no joke. It impacts the whole population. A population of 25 million or so, 6 million just disappears in the matter of a decade. So the country is under enormous stress and difficulty. On the one side, you have the Chavista machine. It's an election machine. There's like 1 million people organized in comunas and so on. They have a big machine. They can bring out several million people whenever they need to, because people are mobilized, And secondly, the ideology of Chavismo has deep roots. Even though there are difficulties in the country, even though, yes, there are serious problems of, petty corruption and so on, the Chavistas just believe in their project. They know, and here's the important point, that the opposition is hideous. The opposition led by Maria Corina Machado comes from the old, what Chavez used to call escualido right wing. The candidate for election this time, Edmundo Gonzalez, was perhaps involved in the torture of people in El Salvador when he was dispatched to the embassy there in the 1980s. Eyewitnesses say that he worked with one of the most important torturers that Venezuela had exported to El Salvador to help it in its torture and interrogation programs. These are hideous people. So the Chavistas would march on the street in the last few weeks and they would say, no volverán. We are not going back. And they mean it precisely. We are not going back to the oligarchy. So that choice between trying to maintain the Bolivarian project, however broken it is, however in difficulty it is, to maintain that here or to return. And Maria Corina Machado, to her credit, hasn't tried to hide her agenda. She is in favor of privatizing the oil company. She has openly talked about returning property to those whom the Chavistas expropriated it from. I mean, this is her open agenda, okay? She is not hiding it. I say to her credit, because if she was a cleverer politician, she would not talk about her agenda. She would only say, Maduro is bad, I'm better, or my, puppet is better, Edmundo Gonzalez. Those are the stakes in the election. Now, interestingly, few days before the actual vote, which was on Chavez's birthday, 28th of July, a poll was released. Now, I found this fascinating. There were several polls, many internet polls done by right-wing newspapers in Venezuela. People who call Venezuela a dictatorship don't understand that the media is mostly right-wing, frankly. It's not a left-wing media. Mostly it's a right-wing media. Anyway, polls appeared. There are no polling agencies of any merit in Venezuela. Sorry, polling agencies, Venezuela. I don't want to disrespect you, but seriously, it's not scientific, okay? But the poll that the opposition picked up on was done by a group called Edison Research, which is based in New Jersey in the United States. And it was actually just a statement, not a poll. It showed that the opposition was 30 points up from Maduro. A huge gap. In Venezuela, you don't see gaps like that. You see 8 points, 9 points gap. Anyway, this statement from this polling agency or this research agency, Edison Research, had no methodology. So there was no polling data. Like, how did you develop this data? Did you do phone surveys? Those are inaccurate because most of the people, the Chavistas, don't have phones. They may have cell phones. How did you get cell phone numbers to do? There was no methodology. I mean, it's totally unscientific way to present a poll. And secondly, Edison Research is a contractor of the CIA. It does a lot of jobs for Central Intelligence Agency outfits. Radio Free Liberty, things like that. Openly on their website, they tell you these are the things we're doing. It's not hiding anything. So Maria Corina Machado said, well, we're up by 30 points based on a CIA contractor. The next day, when the results started coming up, they had lost by 7 points. And they said the election was stolen. Now, I don't know whether the election was stolen or not, but you cannot say that it was stolen based on a fake poll done by a CIA contractor. Interestingly, after Chavez died, Maduro ran against Capriles, who was the opposition candidate, much better candidate than Edmundo Gonzalez or Maria Corina Machado. And the opposition made a lot of the fact that Chavez is now dead, there's nobody to lead the project. And Maduro won that election 51 to 49. Extremely close election. That 51% is interesting. A lot of people I talked to said that's about where the Chavistas land. They are able to secure, if less than 10 million people vote, the Chavistas will win 50 plus 1 votes. If more than 12 million votes, they may not win 50.1 plus 1 vote. But this election result seemed fair to most people. And I think that's where it is. Now, why do Lula, I don't understand. I mean, the facts are pretty clear. Like there's no evidence. And they keep saying, well, why don't they publish the actas? Firstly, a foreign government cannot ask for the voting rolls to be published on its demand. That's bizarre understanding of sovereignty, right? Can you imagine if I say, I demand that the Brazilians release their polling records? I mean, who am I to demand anything? Who is Mr. Lula? I mean, I highly respect him and love him and so on, but he doesn't have any legal standing. A political party in Venezuela can actually request that. And interestingly, Edmundo Gonzalez has refused to appear at the Supreme Court to make a demand asking for the acts to be released. Why? Why are they not coming forward and demanding it along the legal lines? Why are they doing it outside the court? It's my opinion that they don't really want the acts to be released. Because if they are actually released, they may show that there was, the limited fraud that normally happens in election has happened. I'm never going to say there's no fraud in an election, okay? There's always some fraud in every election. Some percentage of some local person went nuts and did so. It's always possible. But why are they not because they want to make the argument for fraud without actually allowing the process to be cleaned up. They're going to continue because since 2004, the referendum against Chavez, which failed, the opposition has called every election fraud. Every election since 2004, they have said is fraud. That's 20 years of crying fraud. They cry fraud. That's what they do. Why don't you try to win an election? An opposition politician told me about four years ago, December 2020. He was very funny. He told me that we can never really win an election unless we become Chavistas, like right-wing Chavistas. He said that Chavez thing about social welfare is now ingrained in Venezuelan society. So he said, we need to be right-wing Chavistas. He said, I'm trying to find a way to square free market economics with Chavez. And I was like, I shook his hand and said, good luck, man. But you see, he gets the point that it's hard. Now, maybe in 6 years, if the attack on Venezuela continues, the privations continue, people will just say, I want to surrender. That's different. That's different. That's a surrender to the imperialist attack on Venezuela. But right now, the people are not surrendering. And I am sorry to say I don't understand why Boric and Lula and others are being so strange about this issue. At the very least, they should say, let's have a conversation about what's going on, why it's happening like this, and so on. They got to, maybe Lula should go to Venezuela. If he was willing to go to Tehran to make the peace deal, why isn't Mr. Lula go to Caracas, meet Maria Corina Machado, meet Edmund Gonzalez, meet Mr. Maduro, meet other people in the government, go to the CNE, have a serious look at things, and then make a public statement. But to make it in a kind of cavalier way, I don't think is entirely helpful.
Vijay, one of your most most recent books is called The Withdrawal, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and the Fragility of West Power. This book was written with Noam Chomsky. As the total war against Gaza continues and escalates, what's the importance of of course, there's Afghanistan in Asia, Libya in Africa, we could call the Muslim world, or some kind of expanded Middle East, whatever. But what's the importance of that region? And most important, what are where the geopolitical implications of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan? Because it seems to me that people haven't paid as much attention to this fact as it deserved back then.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The US goes into Afghanistan in the second phase in 2001, long before the Chinese pivot towards Central Asia, long before. They went there because of the attack on the United States in September 11th. That was a separate issue. But while the United States was occupying Afghanistan from 2001 to roughly 2021, during that period, China begins to pivot westward. It's called a Go West policy. What the Chinese government understands is when the West had its banking crisis in 2007, 2008, that China couldn't bet on the West for the security of its economy, that just producing things for a dying Western market was just not a safe bet. So China did, in my opinion, three different things to balance out its reliance on the Western market. One was the belief that they should increase the consumption of people in China, produce for their own market. And this led to the eradication of absolute poverty. The eradication of absolute poverty is firstly a thing by itself, but it also provided Chinese economy to recycle some of the surplus within the country, to build physical plant, build cities and so on within the country, improve quality of life of people. Secondly, they decided to do this Go West, which is to develop Western provinces of China. This, of course, the center of this was Xinjiang, because what China had done, which many countries do, is ignored the kind of periphery of the country. China emphasized the economic growth on the Pacific seaboard, ignored Tibet, ignored Xinjiang, ignored Mongolia. Turns out, of course, this is all the areas of ethnic minorities, the Miao people, and this is also the areas of greatest absolute poverty. So this came together. They began big investments in Xinjiang province. Now, of course, this got wrapped up in this attack on China, saying that you're conducting a genocide in Xinjiang. Very interesting. There was like an argument made, there's slave labor in the cotton fields of southern Xinjiang. Well, the only person that could have rebutted that argument was a US company called John Deere. I don't know if you know John Deere. John Deere produces and exports combine harvesters, very large machines to harvest cotton and other crops, wheat and so on. And they produce tractors and so on, very big tractors. So John Deere received a very large order from the Chinese government to deliver these enormous machines into southern Xinjiang, where they mechanized cotton. At the same time as John Deere equipment was being used to mechanize cotton production, the people who were attacking the Chinese government saying they're slave labor. I mean, you can't have both things at the same time. John Deere should have made a public statement. Now, it's true that when you mechanize agriculture, you do displace a lot of workers and you have to absorb them. But that's different from slave labor. That's a problem of the production forces being improved. And then you have to absorb labor or you produce transfer. Anyway, the Chinese Go West policy moved beyond Xinjiang into Central Asia and became part of what was called the One Belt, One Road, later Belt and Road. And the third part of the strategy was to expand Belt and Road to Africa, Latin America, and so on. Now, in expanding Belt and Road out of Central Asia, Afghanistan became a key place. But at the time, United States was occupying Afghanistan. So the Chinese built their belt and their road north of Afghanistan. They went, basically through Central Asia, through Uzbekistan and so on, down into Iran, and then up into Turkey, Lake Van, cross Lake Van, go across Turkey. And the trains were going all the way to Europe. It's a remarkable construction project, but they ignored Afghanistan. When the United States pulled out, there was some moderate interest in Beijing of improving infrastructure in Afghanistan. But given the political and social instability in the country, Beijing does not like to get involved in countries where there's enormous social instability, because you're doing long-term infrastructure projects. You don't want to build a train line and then it gets blown up tomorrow. Nobody wants that. So they just basically are waiting for the situation in Afghanistan to settle. Now, that's the other thing, is that for the Afghan people, this is an enormous opportunity. Unfortunately, the Taliban have been less than intelligent in their governance of Afghanistan, and they have not seen the huge possibilities that they could turn to the Chinese and really build the capacity of Afghan people, particularly, and taking a page out of the Chinese book. I mean, they could have decided that, in parts of Afghanistan, I mean, I don't know how well Afghanistan, but there's a strip that links China into Afghanistan called the Wakhan Corridor. I've been down that corridor. It's extremely, unbelievably poor. And you can effectively run a train line through the Wakhan Corridor all the way out to Kabul. I mean, that would change the situation in the country dramatically. And the other thing is, people don't realize this. Afghanistan is extremely endowed in raw materials. In the area just outside the Wakhan Corridor, you'd come into some of the great flat lands near Faizabad and so on, where there are all kinds of precious metals, lapis lazuli, things like that, which could be useful in the jewelry market. But if you linked all that with infrastructure, then you can send Afghan goods by train to Iraq, to Iran, places like that where there's a market for it. Right now, all these precious metals and jewels get smuggled out of Faizabad. They go directly north to Tajikistan. They go to some airport near Dushanbe and they get flown out of the country. And there's no revenue for Afghanistan. The people who dig that with their fingers don't make any money. So there could have been, after the US withdrawal, an immense advantage, but the Taliban just don't see it. They are actually also kind of fighting to maintain their own legitimacy. Pakistan has decided to expel the Afghan refugees back into Afghanistan. I mean, how the government in Kabul is going to absorb all these people, I don't know. The US has lost interest, okay? They've really lost it. It demonstrates their lack of sincerity when they come into a country, But here, the Chinese have things on the table, which, I know that they've talked about it. They own a copper mine, which has been sitting dormant inside Afghanistan for years. But, it requires the government in Kabul to actually wake up to the possibilities, both on the Iran side and on the Afghanistan side, because Iran as well produces a lot of opportunities for particularly Western Afghanistan, the Herat area where people effectively speak Persian. The economic integration could be great. I mean, the border between Iran and Afghanistan is treated like a military border. It should be a porous border, for people to go back and forth to Herat, and then come out there on the other side. And, you've got this enormous market sitting in Iran, in Kosh and other cities on the border. But sorry, it's not there yet.
Yeah, another topic I like to ask you is about the whole of BRICS in this world that's heading towards conflict. How do you see the future of this bloc considering the internal contradictions. I mean, for instance, of course, we have growing contradictions with Russia's involvement in Ukraine, maybe Brazil taking other positions, but mainly, I think the main contradiction is between India and China, of course, which goes back to date. How do you see that that kind of contradiction developing within a bloc that pursues a multipolar world or some kind of another world, an alternative to this unipolarity had by the United States?
I mean, there's two things. One is that, in fact, there's not so much contradiction within the BRICS bloc because they have a view of the world which is pretty similar. In other words, that national interests should dominate. Not, you shouldn't be a substitute for imperial interests. This, I think, is shared between New Delhi and Beijing. There's a lot that is shared, between these countries. Secondly, I think we need to take a page out of the imperialist book. I mean, the United States and France have a lot of contradictions, especially, when Charles de Gaulle was the president and, and he was on his own Gaullist idea of independent French foreign policy. But yet they maintain their linkages. I mean, they maintain themselves. I mean, France has a strange relationship with NATO, but it operates with and alongside NATO. It's not outside the NATO framework. So we need to learn from them. They don't divorce at the first opportunity. They find a way to maintain working relationships, not just friendly relations, So, I mean, I think we also have a tendency to look at the differences immediately. We have a tendency to do that. I mean, there are lots of internal contradictions and problems. Of course, Iran and Saudi Arabia are both entering BRICS, have both entered BRICS. Now, after the brokerage by China, they're at least talking to each other, but they continue to have problems between each other. It's not that that has ended. These countries dominate the oil market. Yeah, most of the BRICS plus countries are the large OPEC plus countries because Russia has to be included. They are all buying oil, from each other. The Russians are selling and so on. That's an enormous commonality. There's no divide on how these BRICS plus countries see the wars in Ukraine, in Gaza even. India hasn't come out and actually backed the Israelis, which is interesting. They've called for a two-state solution, just like China. So there are lots of commonalities. And I think they are working on the principle of basically commonality and consensus. I mean, this is the reason why one is frustrated with the BRICS project, because they are going so slowly. They haven't really achieved much that's substantial. The contingency reserve arrangement, which was to substitute for the International Monetary Fund, hasn't really been put in place. The BRICS Bank, now run by former Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff, it's not doing enough. It's not doing what it could do. It has a large capital, but it's unable to, build projects that would put it on the map. And that's partly because the directors of the bank have very different opinions. These are long-term projects. Like BRICS, as Chou En-lai said, 200 years after the French Revolution, he was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? 200 years later, he said, it's too soon to tell. I mean, the BRICS has only been around, for 15 years. And, one has to be, I suppose, a little bit cautious about making an enormous, either dismissing it or whatnot. These are processes. And the fact that these very large countries continue to meet every year outside brokerage by the West is extraordinary. I mean, of course, the G77, a non-aligned movement, they met for decades outside Western brokerage, but that was a different period. This is the first political and economic body of the non-West created after the fall of the Soviet Union. And therefore, it's going to take time to mature. I think it would be a mistake to dismiss it too quickly. At the same time, one shouldn't be too enthusiastic. We should be watchful. In all things, people like us need to watch and learn as much as possible, and devour the facts. Let judgment come from the facts, not from your prejudices.
Yeah, finally, I think this is the last stressful question, or maybe the most. These times in which we are living in, I think one characteristic of it, especially in third world countries, is a kind of unconscious nihilism. So young people in general are in a rush to live, which usually translates to consume for those who have money or have the means, or to make money for those who don't have these means. And older people have this idea of, well, I lost too much time already, so I gotta take care of the kids or something like that. These two attitudes combine, and I think this has to do with neoliberalism, with a general disbelief in politics and in the ability to change things. How do you see this issue, this relationship between people and time and hope? Does it actually have something to do with neoliberalism? And most important, how do you convince people that it's worth struggling?
Well, you've described the problem very well. So there's very little to add to it. And maybe my answer is just yes. Yes, it's true. This has a lot to do not only with neoliberalism, but there's some other factors. There's, the growth of cities, the expansion, physical expansion of cities. Yes, neoliberalism has contributed to rising property prices, which has moved people out further into the peripheries of cities. The decline in public transport as a consequence of austerity cuts and so on has made it more difficult to come into the center of cities where many people work and so on. This lengthens not the working day per se, but the working day plus the commute. And that just kills your time. By the time you get home, you're exhausted. There are so few social services out there that they are all privatized in the home. You got to take care of your children. You got to take care of the elderly and so on. People don't have the energy to do much, let alone go to meetings for something that they think may or may not happen. Can things be changed? And what then sometimes happen is this disaggregation, this despair can lead you to the far right, because you just sort of latch on to a heroic character of the right and say, please save me. The emergence of these characters of the right who are saviors comes from a futility. Like, what, I'm fed up with. I don't want to get involved. I don't want to build neighborhood structures of politics and so on. Just let somebody either save me or forget it. I'm going to watch TV, watch a Netflix show, spend time with my children, eat some horrible processed food and so on. That's the reality. I understand that. You can't lecture people and say, oh, but you must. You see, the issue is there are contradictions. So people are not all in that situation. There are some people who just say, I don't want to lead such an undignified life. The thing about humanity is humans inherently have the capacity to hope to make things better. This sometimes gets narrowed to hope that my family's situation improves, that I'm going to work really hard to make my children's lives better and so on. But that's still hope. It's just that it's been narrowed to my children or my relatives or whatnot. So now the idea is, how do you socialize that hope? How do you make it something bigger? And this is a challenge. In some countries, we've seen the children of these parents radicalize the parents again, because they experience political struggles in universities, cuts in public spending, cuts in this, rising fees, and so on. There are abstract, genuine structures that oppress students, that lead them to politics, and they bring politics back home. If you and I did a show where we said people must get involved, we sound like people who are just nasty. You know, we're just nasty people saying, oh, the world is so bad, nobody's. It's not that people are making choices. The structures are producing a certain consciousness. I'm that orthodox in my understanding of the world. You know, when you give good public transport and you have daycare centers and you have jobs where people don't have to go home and continue to work on their computers, on their phones, whatever, they have increased leisure time. If they have increased leisure time, a portion of that can go to politics. That's where the structure, the base, creates a superstructure, which is a political consciousness. So I mean, that there's truth to that. If you don't have time and leisure, you can't be political. You could be political if your children walk in the door and say, listen, mother, father, you know, this is crazy. You know, I might have to go to jail or whatever. You know, I just was at a protest to end the war in Gaza and they fired tear gas, and the parents could either say, we don't want you to get involved, it's too dangerous, you are the future of our family, or they may say, this is ridiculous, I'm coming to the next march. And in fact, that happens. You know, I consider this the predictability of unpredictable protests. You know, protests happen, but their outcomes are unpredictable. And that unpredictability is predictable. It's predictable that when Pedro goes to a protest on Gaza, he suddenly discovers, oh my God, I'm at a protest for the people of Palestine. Now, 3 days later, he sees a flyer which says protest to increase funds for for public transport. And Pedro thinks, well, my mother worked in the public transport. I want to go and defend the workers. Suddenly he goes for another protest. This is the predictability of unpredictable protests. It creates people who then become political. You and I can't just yell and scream and say, do it. What happens is the world produces things. It produces spontaneously. The structure of capitalism and imperialism is so nasty. They spontaneously produce resistance. The question then comes, who organizes the resistance? That is a different question than what do you do with the generation that's sitting on their phones? They're not on their phones, because even when they're on their phones, they may be transmitting information about the war in Gaza. You know, they could be doing that. They could be doing important ideological work for their peers. Question is, they then go to a demonstration, they go to another demonstration, and then what happens? That's the question of political involvement. Where's the Workers' Party? Where are the sectarian left parties? Are they picking up people from this bewilderment? I went to 3 protests, now what do I do? Is somebody knocking on their door and saying, friend, you went to 3 protests, let me introduce you to a whole world of political activity. You don't have to just go to protests. You could do the following things. You can go door to door and talk to people about the brutality of the war. You can build a local club in your neighborhood, which is a club against police violence. You can do this, you can do that. That is politics. And that happens in a way spontaneously. It's not true that people are not political today. What I think is true, and where I take some responsibility, small, tiny responsibility, is that my generation has done a very bad job of exploring with people younger than us the importance of that next phase, which is the political organizing. Political organizing follows the spontaneous, the theoretically spontaneous protests that take place because the world is wretched. Then what do? I can't go and germinate the protests from nothing. The protests are generated spontaneously. I don't instigate them. But what do I do after people go? That's the key question. And we can't talk about it today because that's a whole question about national political cultures and how people get organized.
Vijay, we are heading towards the end of this interview, but we always ask our guests if they have some kind of recommendations, books or films or even TV shows. Do you have any recommendation?
first thing I would say is I always have a book recommendation because I'm an editor at Leftward Books, and I recommend other people's books too. But we have just published a book in English by Sevim Dagdelen. It's an important book. It's about NATO. Now, Sevim Dagdelen is a member of parliament in the Bundestag in Germany. She used to be a leading parliamentarian with Die Linke, and then broke from Die Linke along with her colleague Sarah Wagenknecht, and they've created a group called Bundes Sarah Wagenknecht, which actually did twice as well as Die Linke in the European elections. And Sevim is the international spokesperson for the Bundes Sarah Wagenknecht. And this book is really good because it's a small little book. It's just about 100 odd pages. And it's a great introduction to NATO because, she talks about NATO's economic wars, the destruction of Yugoslavia, the broken promises to the Soviet Union, the Ukraine war, and so on. It's small, it's a primer, and it's great. It's in German, it's in English, and I hope someday this will be out in Portuguese so that readers in Brazil can devour it. It's not a scholarly work. This is a work of agitation to get you the most accurate information about NATO coming from an elected member of parliament in Germany, a key NATO country.
Do you have any recommendation of films, movies, or TV shows?
Well, I know that this is a big thing in Opera Mundi, and I started to say earlier that I just unfortunately haven't watched anything recently that I would feel comfortable talking about, because I've seen a couple of juvenile children's movies and I've watched some romantic films. I don't want to get into those, okay? But the other day I was cleaning out some of the old boxes I had, and I found a stack of DVDs of my favorite director in the whole world. And unfortunately, I don't have a DVD player, so I had to give them away. But he is definitely the crowning director, not only of Japan, but of the post-war world. His name is Yasujiro Ozu. And Ozu is a contemporary of Akira Kurosawa and others. They work together. Now, Ozu himself is not a radical filmmaker. He's not a Marxist or anything. But what's interesting about his movies is they're all made basically after the atomic bomb in 1945. This still you're seeing is from the 1953 movie Tokyo Story. What's compelling about his films is his film is about Japan trying to reconstruct itself after the defeat to the Allies and after the nuclear bomb. And it's about Japan dealing with things like family relations, gender relations, Japanese customs, and occasionally you will see conversations about the war, the entry of American culture into Japan in a big way. But for me, the most extraordinary thing about Yasujiro Ozu is not only the pacing and timing of the film. The films are very slow paced, but Japanese old homes, people sit on a mat, a tatami mat. They sit on the floor. They eat off low tables and so on. What Ozu did was Ozu put the camera at the level of sitting on a tatami mat. And so the movies are filmed at the level of people. People are at the center of it. He doesn't film from above. He doesn't have his camera on a big stand. It's all from the level of the tatami mat, or when a person is walking, they pan at eye level. He's one of the most conscientious filmmakers. It's almost like every scene is sculpted. If you want to see something similar to Ozu, you can watch the early Kurosawa movies, not the martial films of later, but even Kurosawa's great film Dodeskadan. Kurosawa made a movie about the daughter of a communist who's dating somebody and there's an assassination. I don't want to tell the story because it's precious. But those early Kurosawa movies are super political, and they are made with the same kind of light touch as Yasujiro Ozu. Japanese films of the 1950s and 60s, including the Godzilla films. I'm never far away from my Godzilla. I always keep my Godzilla nearby because, I mean, you may want to know that Godzilla, these films are about the atom bomb. I mean, this is a critique of atomic culture. And those early Japanese films are all marked by the atom bomb and by emergent Japanese socialism and Marxism. Even though Yasujiro Ozu himself was not a Marxist or anything, his films are imbued with a kind of logic of ordinary people. And I mean, I adore it. Like, his characters go into plebeian, ordinary, working class bars and they interact with people there. It's scenes of great dignity of workers, the people who cook in these places and so on. The films are really about, can Japan survive the destruction of an earlier civilization? It's a beautiful, beautiful director.
Well, Vijay, I'd like to thank you very much for your time and for this conversation. It was an honor, as I said, and it's always good to talk to you.
Hey, it's a pleasure for me, okay? I'm looking forward to the next time we can talk about films and so on, but that's for another day.
All right, thank you very much. Eu também agradeço a todos e a todas que assistiram a esse programa, em especial a vocês que puderam fazer contribuições financeiras ao nosso site e ao canal de Opera Mundi no YouTube. Sem vocês, o nosso trabalho não seria possível e não faria sentido. Então, um grande abraço e até o próximo programa.